Good morning, everybody. You're very welcome to this morning's National Recruitment Federation breakfast briefing on the Recruiter's Guide to Growing Your Temp and Contractor Business. I'm Donal, NRF President, and I'm delighted to be joined this morning by Jimmy Sheehan, Managing Director at ContractingPLUS, and Jennifer Doyle, Client Solutions Manager at ContractingPLUS. Good morning, Jimmy. Good morning, Jennifer.
Morning.
How are you?
Thanks for inviting us on.
Great to see you guys. So we've had a huge amount of interest in this topic because I think particularly after the 18 months that we've all been through and the resilience that recruitment businesses have shown, particularly the ones that have a strong temp and contractor book, this is a key strategic objective for many recruitment businesses, business owners and consultants. So what we want to do this morning is give a bit of an overview of a number of different areas. So I'm going to just share my screen and hopefully technology will be in our favor. We've had a few glitches this morning. Jimmy, can you see that?
Yeah, I can see the screen perfectly.
Yeah, great stuff. So we have, you can see the three main groups, the PowerPoint page, yeah?
Yeah.
Perfect, great. Okay. So the three main groups that we've got joining us this morning are people from executive search firms. And as you'll all know, executive search firms place senior executives, either head of function, director, or C-suite individuals, usually on a permanent basis. But many of the executive search firms have reached out to us to say that they're particularly interested in growing their interim business, where they place interim managers on assignment on a project or on a specific program, and usually on a day rate contract. Those individuals are professional contractors technically and provide services either through their own limited company or through, for example, an umbrella company. The next cohort that we have joining us are recruiters that are particularly interested in placing professional contractors. And the main segments that we have joining us today are placing people in IT, transformation, digital, PMO, and across pharma engineering. And again, these are professional contractors providing services through either a limited company or an umbrella company setup. And then the final cohort are those with temporary agency workers and looking to grow that temporary agency worker book. And they can be across clerical support, operations, and for example, the construction industry as well. One of the things I have to say this morning as well is that the guys at ContractingPLUS have offered a very nice spot prize of this picnic hamper. So I think Jennifer is going to have a question later on. So it'll be based on some of the discussion that we have today. So you've got to listen very carefully. A question is going to go out and we will announce at the end of the webinar who has won this prize. And I think there may be another spot prize throughout as well. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Okay, so as I touched on earlier on, I suppose I just wanted to first draw the distinction between where talent tends to reside in terms of professional contractors and temporary agency workers. And of course, there's some crossover. So on the professional contractor side of things, it tends to be project-based work. So IT contractors across development, testing, networking, change and transformation projects, such as large migrations, when one business has, for example, acquired another business and they need to migrate a customer base from one system to another, or indeed after a business has been sold or divested where a separation project needs to occur. Pharma and biotech is a particularly strong area for professional contractors, particularly in Ireland. All of the engineering disciplines. The growth area that we're seeing at the moment is business advisors and independent non-executive directors, people that are later in their career that are now looking to develop revenue streams across a number of different businesses, and then consultants across strategy and planning, marketing, HR, procurement, finance, actuarial, mergers and acquisitions, and transformation. On the temporary agency side of the house, we're seeing a lot in clerical and public sector. Of course, healthcare in the last 18 months has been particularly busy. All of the logistics, operations, and drivers, construction professionals across trade and labor has been particularly strong with plenty of demand in the market there. And then usually in the public sector, we're seeing very strong demand for all the clerical and professional services. So marketing, HR, customer service, procurement, and finance. Okay, so that's just a very brief overview of where the talent is residing. One of the things that we wanted to do, because many questions came in, was to talk a little bit about the benefits to the client of non-permanent resource, whether temporary or contractor. So we've just put a few areas down here, 6 areas to talk through very quickly. And the first benefit for a consultant when you're talking to your client about non-permanent resourcing is that this is not regarded by HR as headcount. So for example, we saw during slower markets where businesses, whether in financial services or in public sector, implemented hiring freezes for permanent hires, they were still able to resource gaps and business critical roles through non-permanent resource, either temporary agency workers or professional contractors. The other benefit with this, because it doesn't sit as headcount budget spend, it can reside in the departmental budget. So for example, a marketing department or a product department might be able to use some of their budget to bring in additional resource. Of course, the flexibility that non-permanent resource is highly valuable, where a business has a fixed headcount but needs to fill gaps around maternity leave or sometimes long-term sick leave. The ability to bring in a temporary or contract resource is obviously very beneficial there. One of the things that's also a positive is that the ability to use temporary or non-permanent resource lowers attrition within the permanent headcount at very busy times. So for example, in finance departments coming up to year end, the ability to bring in contractors or temporary resource can actually lower the attrition of an overwhelmed or overworked full-time equivalent population. The other area that temporary resource is really useful for is launching a new product or testing a new product. Again, it reduces the risk of bringing on a full-time team of permanent hires. You can test a resource or test a new product offering in the market with temporary resource. And of course, the cost effectiveness is one of the key drivers. The idea of talent on tap, the ability to access the skills you need when you need them. For example, if it's for a 6 or 9 month period, and then switch off the tap when you don't need that resource in the business is very cost effective. And then the final one, which is really, really beneficial, is the ability to access knowledge and best practice, sometimes from your direct competitors. So if you think about IT change and transformation projects, which many businesses are going through, the ability to bring a team in or bring somebody in who's done a very similar project for a direct competitor and take the learnings from that business into your own is highly valuable. So they are just some of the areas of benefit to the client. And of course, from the candidate's perspective, there are benefits as well. As we mentioned, the premium rate to contractors is one of the key drivers, key reasons and key benefits that people choose to take a contract opportunity. Sometimes the premium can be anywhere from 20 to 40% on their permanent equivalent salary. The next benefit can be, we talked about the construction industry, it can be as simple as proximity to site. So if you think about construction, trade and labor personnel that are based in a specific area, because they're going to have equal treatment to the directly employed staff, their pay and conditions will be in line. However, when a construction project finishes, if they're employed by an agency, they may be deployed to another site for a different contractor that's close to their home, rather than having to move, if they were directly employed, to a new site for their employer that might be far from their home. So that level of flexibility we hear is a very strong benefit. The ability to build candidate value and build your CV by accessing skills across different businesses, different brands, and different organizations is definitely a positive one. For the IT contractors, we certainly see the ability to follow interesting project and interesting work and building out their value in the market through accessing and working on those projects is a key one. And then for the temporary agency workers, a really important one in slower markets is that temporary agency work is a way for people to access permanent job opportunities. The reason for that is that we know that about 35% of temps convert to permanent. So it's a way to access permanent opportunities in the labor market. And as there's more and more people talking about building diverse careers and side hustles and building other revenue streams of income, sometimes temporary agency work or working as a professional contractor can supplement those other income streams. So there are a few of the topics in the introduction that we're going to talk about today. We have a lot of questions to go through, but I might just throw it over to Jennifer and say, hi, Jen. We've been talking about a lot of different things in preparing for this, everything from cost comparisons to what you're seeing in the market. So I'd love to hear from you this morning.
Yeah, look, I think in terms of what we're seeing in the market, I think there's an awful lot of activity in the contingent workforce. And I suppose, look, the last 18 months, I think you referenced it earlier, companies that have thrived are probably those that are able to adapt and able to be flexible to meet, industry demands. And I think contingent workforce allows them to do that. It gives you the flexibility to, fill a skill gap maybe that's, appeared on the team. It gives you that ability to scale up when project demands are there. So definitely we're seeing a lot of queries coming through, and from our perspective, I suppose as well, a lot of queries that are coming through from first-time contractors, which is great to see. So about 70% of the queries we're getting at the moment are from those who have never maybe contracted before. So there's definitely interest in the market at the minute. I think in terms of the benefits of contracting or the benefits of working as a contingent worker, you've touched on a lot of them there. I think the financials are definitely a motivator for a lot of people and have been. But again, over the last 18 to 24 months, we've really seen that change. And a lot of people are now talking about a work-life balance. They're talking about the ability to decide how and where and when they work. And I think those things are becoming much more, I suppose they're higher priorities for people. So again, the contingent model gives the candidate a lot of flexibility as well.
Brilliant. Actually, one of the topics that we were quite keen to talk about was this idea of building not just contractor numbers, not just temp numbers, but building a profitable business and a profitable desk. So what I might do is I'm going to share this again. Just again, Jimmy, will you let me know if that's come up? Okay.
Yeah, that's up there now, Donal.
Super. So this is an interesting one. So what I did here was just put together a quick idea, because one of the questions that came in from people was like, what kind of numbers do I need to have? Because there's a lot of permanent recruiters in the market that are very interested in developing a temporary business line or a line of professional contractors, but they're unsure of how the margin and the values work. So I just put this together to give a quick indication. This is for temporary agency workers. So in the case where we have, in this scenario, we've a temporary worker that's been paid 15 euros an hour, and the agency has put a margin of 15% on it. That means the charge to the client is 22.06 per hour. So the margin value to the organization is 3.31 per hour. Based on a 7.5-hour day, it's just under 25 euros margin per day. And if you take conservatively 20 working days per month, it gives you the indication that to generate 15K gross profit as a recruiter, you need 30 temps out at that level. And so what does that mean? It really depends on the business that you're in, because to effectively plan your revenue stream, there's the magic number in recruitment. Typically, when somebody starts out in their first kind of 2 or 3 years, you'll often hear that there's a target of 15,000 euros per consultant. And the reason for that is very simple. That 15,000 euros target breaks into 3 areas. Approximately 5,000 is allocated to pay the consultant, so their salary, their employment costs, their cost of their seat. 5,000 is a contribution towards the office overheads. So if you look at the P&L for a recruitment division or a recruitment company, if you look at your entire overheads, less your payroll and salaries, health insurance, commission, etc. costs, the on costs are typically, maybe 1,000 euros per week per consultant by the time you take your job boards and etc. And then the three segments of that 15K target are 5K for the consultant, 5K towards costs, and 5K is a direct contribution towards operating profit. So that's the magic number you want to go for. When the consultant is familiar with these numbers and when the consultant realizes the average length of assignment, the next thing they've got to do is they've got to figure out what is their attrition rate, what's the average rate of their assignment, because ultimately to build that contract book, you need to figure out what the net gain of temps or contractors per month required is. You've also got to see what can you do to move the other levers. and the other dials in terms of how can you increase your average margin, how can you perhaps increase your average rate to the temp or to the contractor. Another example that I did here shows for a professional contractor. So in this case, we've somebody say running an IT contract desk or something like that. Their pay rate to the contractor is 350 euros per day. Their average margin is 15%. That leaves you with a margin value of 61.76 per day and 20 working days per month. So these are the numbers I think that consultants need to kind of to bear in mind and to think how can they move the dial on the different ones.
Donal, I might just jump in there and ask you a question because I think everyone's always interested in the numbers. But there's, and you touched on it briefly, but there are, I imagine, other levers that people can pull in terms of increasing the value of a temp or a contract desk. What would those tend to be? Yeah,
so I think one of the first ones to be really strong on is your average margin. So like, for example, with a temp desk, if you take the example of that we had there a few minutes ago, where there's a temporary agency worker that's being paid about 15 euros an hour, 15% margin. So the agency has a margin of €3.31 or 25 euros per day. I think it's really important to realize that if you build that desk, that hypothetical desk that we're talking about for that type of business, and you have 30 runners, okay, you have 30 temps out. Well, what can you do? If you can get your average margin, for example, up to 17.5%, and like just by moving that one lever alone, or if you move another lever, if you can get your average rate to the temp up to 17 euros, for example, from 15, and your average margin up to 17.5, you go from having 15K per month gross profit to 20K per month gross profit. You know, you go from having a 180K desk to having a 240K desk. And again, for the consultant, the recruiter typically earns about a third of their gross profit. So, you know, that's salary plus commission included in that number. So it can be very lucrative. So it's really about getting the product mix right. And one of the other things that's really important, I think, that many people don't think about is what is your minimum fee required, right? So say, for example, if a client comes to you and says, look, I want to bring somebody in for 3 months, and it's this scenario where, you know, it's a 15 euro per hour pay rate, but it's only a 3-month assignment. If you think about it, if you're making 25 euros per day, it takes about 6 months to get 4K gross profit. And if you think about the cost of resourcing a role between paying a recruiter to work a role for a week, all of the advertising costs, the overheads involved, your costs are probably about 2K. So if you're not getting a minimum return on that placement of 4K, it's really not profitable business. So at that point, that's where the consultant needs to work it back and figure out, if I want to make 4K and it's a 3-month assignment, where does my margin need to be? And in this case, the consultant would need to increase their margin to 25% because it's a 3-month engagement. And with the same numbers, 25% will give them a margin of just over 4,000 euros in that 3-month period. So
there is such thing as bad business, and it's important that people recognize that and don't apologize if you have those shorter contracts. You know, you've got to look for that. It might look like a 36 or a 40% markup, but actually over such a short contract length, you need that in order to be profitable.
Exactly. And the other thing that we've got to think about as well is that the shorter the contract, the smaller the pool of candidates that we have to choose from is. So it's not just about making sure that you as a business are writing profitable business, but it's also making sure you're able to resource the role. So for example, if somebody's being asked to come in, if you think about a professional contractor, the largest pool of contractors are interested in a day rate contract on a rate that matches their target day rate expectation. And usually they're happy for anything from 6 to 12 months. The biggest pool of contractors will like the 12-month contract, and then the pool reduces slightly as you go down to 9 months and 6 months. As soon as you're talking to a contractor about a 3-month engagement or something like that, it just isn't as attractive. So what do you have to do to increase that pool of candidates? You've got to negotiate with your client a premium on that day rate to make it so good that that in-demand talent doesn't want to refuse it. And then, of course, the positive with that, if you can get a lucrative day rate for your contractor, a reasonably good margin for your recruitment business, and the contractor goes in and does a good job, if that negotiation is done well initially, of course, the chance of extension continues. and you're under the contract for service. So that will continue.
We see that where you do see some of the 3-month or 4-month contracts come in, or the 6-month contracts come in. But actually what's interesting, and you'll be familiar, and a lot of people online might be, with the research by Trinity College last year, Ireland's project economy, which looked at all the contingent workers, the professional contingent workers in Ireland. And the contractors answered that, recruiters fed into that, and the clients themselves fed into that. But interestingly, from the recruiters, 94% of contract roles were typically between 6 and 12 months. And then when we looked at when the contractors were asked, the average role was 14 months. So certainly not whereas the temp contracts probably are shorter in term and turnover quicker. The professional contractor book maybe doesn't have the same level of turnover. It's a higher rate of pay, and they're less likely to go permanent then as well. So which probably allows you build a more solid desk than a temp one.
Yeah, it really depends. Definitely when we have a client that's coming to us that has it depends on the need, I think initially, because sometimes you'll have an organization that comes to you, and for example, if it's a gap fill like maternity leave, and the expectation in the candidate pool might be, or the expectation in the client's organization might be, that they need to bring somebody in on equal treatment. You know, for example, if it was replacing somebody that's on 40K that's gone on maternity leave, occasionally that will come in as a temporary resource requirement. And then should the person not return from maternity leave, that person, if they've been there for 9 or 10 or 11 months or 12 months, they'll often convert to perm, which is what drives that metric I was talking about earlier on. But it really depends where the talent is based. Like, for example, if we're talking about professional contractors in IT and engineering, they're simply not interested in working as a temporary agency worker, because they're just, it's how they're set up. They're used to the control, they're used to the tax planning, and they're used to being able to follow interesting work. So it really depends in both ways. But actually, we're seeing even longer tenures than that for contractors. You know, I have examples of MSPs where the average tenure could be 24, 26, 28 months, which is a huge benefit, because remember, with temporary agency workers, typically agencies won't allow them to work on an assignment for more than 23 months, because there's potential risks associated with redundancy, and
redundancy kicks in after the 2 years.
After the 2 years. So it really depends on the need. It really depends where the talent resides as well. And what's quite interesting from the client's perspective, I did a little cost comparison here, because again, some of the questions that came in coming up to the event related to, you know, what's the best solution to recommend to your clients, etc. So can you see that cost comparison okay?
Yeah, that's coming up, Donal.
Super. So this was an example where a client has set a budget of 400 euros per day. And I wanted to just show how this breaks down. And Jimmy, I'll ask you to come in on this in a second, how it breaks down between bringing somebody in as a temporary agency worker or as a professional contractor. So I've just done a quick calculation. Based on a client budget of 400 euros per day, working back from the statutory annual leave and bank holiday entitlement, so 20 days annual leave plus 9 bank holidays, and putting in an agency margin at 15%, that allows for a pay rate to the temp of 272.76 euros per day. So that works out to an annualized salary of almost 71,000 euros. If we take the same budget of 400 euros a day and we work that back for a professional contractor, this is where I think the agency has a little bit more room to play, because based on that budget of 400 euros per day and taking out 15% margin for the agency, that allows you to pay to the contractor through either an umbrella company or their own limited company 340 euros per day. So if that contractor takes 6 weeks off, you know, takes off their bank holidays and their and 4 weeks holidays during the year, they're still going to put timesheets in for 230 days. That gives them 78,200, which is, you know, nearly 7.5, 8 grand more. And they've also got the benefits in terms of their tax planning and their expenses. And the other thing that's interesting here is that if the consultant has a range of candidates that have an expectation of, you know, between 300 euros a day and 350 euros a day, you know, there is the ability to put some resource in there and have a little bit more agency margin. For example, paying 300 a day, charging 400 a day, which is still within the client's budget, because sometimes in contractor resourcing, You have to give a little bit on the margin to meet your client's budget. Sometimes, depending on your negotiation with your contractors, you may have a little bit more room to play with the margin. So, Jimmy, when you look at the two of those as an accountant for your sins, what kind of stands out to you in terms of the benefits of taking the contractor gig there over the temp assignment?
Well, I suppose the first thing which my skill set wouldn't be in is in terms of, you know, what the client needs, and I suppose that's where as a consultant you need to come up with. But looking at purely what people take home, and actually I was the accountant in me couldn't help myself. I was jotting down some figures there. But your maths are pretty good there, Donal. So well done. But even the 231 days you talked about as working, I mean that's just so people kind of go, oh, 20 days holidays, is that? You know, that seems a little, if you're talking about the level people might be at, they might want more holidays. Actually, studies have shown that contractors typically only take about an average of 17 days holidays, because they're saying, well, if I take the day off, I'm not getting paid. But looking at those figures, and then you're saying, well, that's what the contractor, the individual might come out with as a temp, or the individual might come out with as a professional contractor or as an employee. But with contracting, you are self-employed. You know, you operate through either an umbrella company or your own personal limited company. And so that gives you extra options. So a couple of high-level ones, without going into too much detail, you look at pension. So for example, if you're an employee or a temp agency and you're paying a temp work and you're paying into a pension, you get tax relief, okay, on the marginal rate of tax you're paying. But if the company pays into that pension for you, actually more money goes into the pension, an extra 11 or 12% goes in. So straight away, your pension pot's going to increase quicker over time. The other couple of things I jotted down there, look, business expenses is the obvious one. And people say, well, are these expenses I'm going to have because I'm a contractor? The answer is no. Some of them might be, but some of them are expenses you're probably already incurring as an employer, as an individual. So, you know, part of your home broadband, buying a new mobile phone handset, the mobile phone handset itself, laptops, you know, all of these types of things, depending on what you're doing. And the reality is, if you have to incur a cost to have a piece of equipment in order to do your job, then that's tax deductible. And what that essentially means is, if you buy something worth €500 as an employee, you've probably had to earn €1,000 to buy that. But if you buy the same thing as a contractor, you invoice €500 and then you get that €500 back. So you're saving about €250 in tax. So business expenses always push up what you actually take home. A couple of other quick ones there would be if you're saving for a mortgage. So you might attract a candidate who's maybe been on 50, 60,000 euros a year. You offer them a role as a temp, or well, actually as a contractor. They're in their own limited company, and now they're earning 70,000 euros a year. So they're actually earning an extra, 10,000. Let's say 10,000. Let's make the maths even smaller so it feels more realistic. But they can actually afford to live on the salary of 60,000, even though they're now earning 70,000. So what do they do with that 10,000 euros? Well, you can leave that in the company and you can build that up over time. And after, say, 5 years, so you've left 50,000 euros in the company. Now, there's a little bit of corporation tax, and the right tax planning needs to be done. But you could come out with the right tax planning. After 5 years, you could come out with about 35,000 euros into your hand. Now, if you would have taken all that out, put it through payroll, and saved it, you're looking at about 10 or 11,000 euros less. So you're talking, do I have 25,000, or I have 35,000? So nearly 50% more savings. So people who are going for mortgages might be interested in that, or maybe have a big life event coming up. And obviously the last one there is tax planning towards retirement. So the average age of contractors that came up out of the Trinity research was 46. But the older you get, the more money you make. And there's a piece of tax planning called retirement relief, which allows you to take up to 750,000 euros tax-free out of your company between the ages of 55 and 65. So all of these... That
without liquidating it, Jimmy, or is that...
No, the retirement relief is you do divest yourself of the company, but retirement relief doesn't necessarily mean you need to retire. You can continue to work, but you can avail of that retirement relief. And again, the oldest contractor I think we have on our books is about 78. So, I mean, people are working longer. They're forced maybe to move away from PAYE employment at 60, 65 because of contracts, but they still have a lot to give. So, you know, there's huge financial benefits, you know,
Brilliant.
in terms of
And just to clarify there, what you're talking about in terms of retaining earnings in a company, that's obviously only applies to people that are operating through their own limited company rather than, for example, an umbrella company setup.
Exactly. So a contractor, I mean, you do contractors and you introduce contractors to us, and it depends on what their long-term goals are, Donal. And do we put them into an umbrella company because they want all of the money? You know, they don't want to buy a company car, they don't want to save the money. But if they want to save the money, then we put them into their own company, and it just allows for a bit more flexible tax planning. Yeah,
and what do you recommend? Because we as an agency, we would tend to recommend that people that are contracting for the first time, to see if it works for them, we tend to recommend that they start with an umbrella setup because it's kind of ready to go and it's available to them quite quickly. And then when they get a feel for contracting and when they can get a feel for whether or not there's enough demand for their skills, because that's always the concern. I think when somebody can be attracted to contracting because they hear it's a really lucrative day rate and they can manage their taxes efficiently, but the concern they have, I think, is what happens at the end of the 6 months or the 9 months or the 12 months. So I think during that period of time, if they've made themselves quite visible in the market as a contractor, and if they've worked their relationships and their networks, and they get a sense that there's plenty of demand for their skill sets, I think it's normally around that kind of when they're taking their second contract or maybe their second extension, that it can be quite a good idea to sit down with somebody like ContractingPLUS or a tax advisor to say, look, is this the most efficient way to work, or should I look at my own company setup at that stage?
Yeah, it also take on board maybe what your client needs or your client has requested in their contracts, and then the agency as well. Bearing in mind, if they move from an umbrella company to a limited company, it's a new contract, so it is new administration, but it's very, very simple. I mean, you're familiar with that, Donal, and the way we work, but typically, say if somebody gets a 6-month contract, you know, and they say, actually, well, it's going to extend to 12 months. And then it's like, well, actually, I like this. And I think I'm going to work this way continuously for a long period of time. We're always consistently talking to them. What can you do from a money point of view? Yeah. There was one of the questions came in and it touches on that. You know, I think it was Niall in CPL asked for tips for convincing companies that contracting is better than perm. And I think I'm going to leave that to you, Donal, because that's your expertise. But I think, you know, there's no point in having a sweet shop if you've no sweets to sell. So you also need to have those relationships with the contractors. So it's important to understand, you know, what the fears or the challenges of individuals might be, first-time candidates, first-time contractors. And if people don't know what to say to those, give Jennifer a shout. Jennifer and her team created a brilliant guide. It's the recruiter's guide to contracting, and it talks about what are all those likely barriers to contracting and how do I answer them and what are the answers. So Jen, you might even, if you have a link to that, you might post that in the chat.
Well, that's a lovely segue, actually, because when we think about that, what are the benefits of selling non-permanent resourcing to a client? One of the things that comes up is the cost comparison, and Jennifer very kindly offered to do a cost comparison when you think about when there's a need in an organization, say, for example, to bring in somebody on a permanent contract, you know, what are a permanent contract of employment, what are the costs aside from salary, and how does that then compare to resourcing a non-permanent solution? So Jen, do you want to maybe do that cost comparison piece?
I'll just share my screen there. Let me know when you guys have it.
Perfect.
Yeah, that's up.
Yeah. Perfect. Okay, so this is, look, quite a simple example, but I suppose what we wanted to try and illustrate here was maybe some of the costs that don't immediately come to mind when you hear a 70k salary. So let's take an example where you have a client, they have a role with an offer of a 70k salary. It could be due to attrition on the team. Maybe they've, you know, had a lot of growth in the industry. Maybe there's a gap in the skill set. So what are the actual costs, I suppose, that are associated with hiring Amy, who's our professional? So I think as well as your gross salary, you know, most companies will offer healthcare. There'll be an employer pension contribution, you know, for the purpose of the illustration, we've gone with about 5%. But then on top of that, you have your employer PRSI costs. The employer PRSI for somebody on this kind of earning level is 11.05%. So I suppose to round that figure out, while it looks like an initial base salary of 70,000, your costs really, I suppose, from a wage and payroll perspective, are closer to 83,500. On top of those costs, you then have your additional costs. So for example, you have your recruitment fee. So we've taken 15%, which is about 10,500. And I suppose that's an upfront cost. Whereas with a contingent model where you're taking on a temp or a contractor, that cost is spread over the course of the contract. For employees, you're likely to have other costs like equipment. So Amy's probably going to need a laptop and a monitor and an ergonomic chair. There's costs that maybe are a little bit harder to quantify also, things like just general administration, having an employee on your payroll, HR costs, and even unforeseen costs. So things like sick leave or sick day, there's statutory sick pay coming in. I think for a total of 3 days, it's starting with coming in next year. So those are additional costs that, your client, the employer, needs to consider when they're looking at actually hiring.
Yeah, very good.
In terms of breaking that figure down, I suppose then if we're to look at, what's the actual daily cost for Amy, the professional, it's probably close to about 361 per day. Now, what I've done there is I've calculated based on the 231. So I suppose just to explain that in case there's anybody on the call maybe who isn't sure where we're coming up with that figure. I suppose, look, there's 52 weeks in the year, Monday to Friday, 5 days a week, which gives us 260 working days, weekdays, and then you've got 20 days holidays, I suppose, would be the norm, with some companies offering a little bit more in your 9 bank holidays. So that's what's bringing us down to that 361 figure. If we were to then look at an alternative to your typical or traditional employment, and if you were to look at a more contingent model, so for example, if we were to, offer this out as a contract for service position, you'd see an uplift. So contractors do receive that premium rate of pay that we've all mentioned, I suppose, for the skill set that they're providing, for the expertise that they're bringing to the role, but also because the employer doesn't have some of those costs. So usually, I think, Donal, you had referenced it could be, we've taken a base of 20 here, it could go up to 40% of an increase. I think that's going to depend on the demand, the skill set, the experience that Amy holds. But for the purpose of the illustration, we've used 20%. So I suppose, again, you can see that I suppose the 70,000 that we have as the original gross salary has increased to 84,000. But once you tot in those additional employment costs that maybe are hidden or less obvious, and then when you convert back down to that daily rate, you'll see that you're actually in line. So ultimately, I think the comparison or that kind of understanding that it's going to be more expensive to look at a contingent model is definitely something that I suppose maybe needs to be challenged in certain circumstances, depending obviously on the client need. And I think, there's other factors to consider. So for example, the project might finish early. What if the project doesn't work out? You've got maybe additional risk. And using a contingent model might help to reduce some of that. It also offers you flexibility. As I said, you're spreading the cost of recruitment over the course of, the contract as well, or the period of work. And it just gives clients, I think, a lot of flexibility in terms of just scaling up and scaling down. So hopefully that helps to just illustrate some of the key considerations that, consultants need to be aware of when speaking to their clients and understanding what their clients' needs are as well.
Brilliant. And actually, I think the question, and what I'd love to do now is just kind of quick fire go through some of the questions that have come in, because as I said, we've had a lot of questions that were sent in pre-event that we'd love to address as well. But I think what you've shown there, Jennifer, is there's no right and wrong with this. There's, you have to look at what the need is within the organization, look at what the budget is, look at where the talent is and what the demands of particularly in a candidate-driven market, which we're in at the moment, and see how do you deliver that need. And there's different ways that you can incentivize that. Like, for example, bringing in a permanent resource. They come in on a permanent contract, they have the probationary period, you hope that they will do well, but it's a different relationship. Bringing in a contract resource, there's the ability to manage that contract, to set, for example, some project deliverables and some incentive payments to bring the project in early, which can potentially reduce the period of time that the resource is on contract. But that's really good. And I think you're about right there. I was looking at your figures, and the 20% premium is probably conservative, but that could be relevant if it was a 12-month contract, and then the shorter the contract, the more we'd push up the premium. So for the 70K salary, I would have thought about somewhere between that 364 and 400 a day, depending on the length of the contract. And it's all about dynamic pricing. It's all about, if you can't get the candidate for 350 or 400 a day, you know, there's no point putting that price out there. So I think consultants have to constantly be aware that pricing for non-permanent resource must be dynamic. You must be able to charge a higher margin for a shorter engagement because, as Jimmy said, you don't want to be writing unprofitable business. And it's that level of flexibility and having your finger on the pulse. And the other metric I think that's really important as well is you've got to be placing 2/3 of the candidates that you screen. So you've got to look at what the demand coming in from your clients is. You've got to have, like, say, for example, if you're an IT recruiter and you place business analysts in financial services, you've got to be able to turn that around quickly. So you've got to be interviewing and screening and assessing who are the top business analysts in whatever vertical of financial services that you practice in or that you recruit in. Because if a client gives you a requirement and you don't have talent and you don't have a rate card and you're not able to turn it around quickly, then you don't have enough talent available. If you're interviewing far more candidates than you're placing, you're spending too much of your time on the candidate side. And actually what you need to do is find your best talent and start bringing it to market. And I think the other thing that's really interesting as well, particularly for perm focused recruiters that want to develop contract business, is to realize these are different stakeholders that you're dealing with. Whereas on the permanent side of things, you might deal with a particular middle manager, a hiring manager, or the HR department. When you're doing contract resourcing, you need to have relationships with the project management office, with the program managers to understand how many work streams and projects they are, how they're being resourced. Is it with FTEs supplemented by professional contractors? Are they all professional contractors? You need to understand whether there's an MSP in place and how to become part of that supply base. So there's a lot of different factors to consider. And
for someone starting out, like,
yeah,
what would be a couple of tips in terms of saying, well, how do I find out that information?
Well, the first thing you got to do is fill a job, you know, so everything starts with the first placement. And one of the questions that came in were on tips to landing larger contracts with clients. And I would say the first thing you've got to do is fill your first contract opportunity. And as soon as you've got that contractor in, whatever professional discipline they're in, it's about managing that relationship and managing the relationship with their hiring manager, spending time, for example, doing a site visit to understand the project or the program of work that's happening, and trying to, I suppose, not view yourself as a recruiter, but as somebody who's solving problems on a particular project or a particular program of work. Because if you can get, in terms of workforce planning, an idea of the forecast of the likely skills that will be in demand, and you can start to plan forward for that and propose 1 or 2 contractors that will have skills that will be required at the next phase of the project, you can then change that 1 placement into 2 placements. When you've got 2 placements in an organization for contractors that are perhaps on, as we said, a day rate of 400 or 500 euros per day, you then have to take that as a case study to market. So if you take your 2 contractors, it's not about just placing 2 contractors, it's what difference do they make? What are they delivering? Writing that as a case study and looking at it. If you take the example, you might do the maths on this, Jimmy, now put you under pressure, but if you got 2 contractors on 500 euros a day, so 2 contractors, so that's 1,000 a day, 20 working days in the month, and they're there for, let's say, 18 months or something like that, right? You then write this into a case study. You go to your other clients, whether you're tendering for work publicly or whether you're just out in the market talking to clients about assignments that you've delivered in other organizations in their sector. And you can show this piece of work, which is a contract value of...
what did you say?
So
20,000 a month, was it, for 18 months?
20,000 a month for 18 months, we're saying.
About 360 grand.
Great. Yeah. So, like, for example, if you tender for a piece of public work, they'll usually ask you what was the projects of similar size and complexity. Even though you might have only placed 2 people into this requirement 18 months ago, you can now show 360 or 400K contract on a development project or a transformation project with a brand. Take that to market, you can replicate it elsewhere. And it's about just looking at then, how do you manage relationships with those different stakeholders? So one of the things that you'll see recruiters do from time to time, if we take the example there where they've made 1 placement, they've turned the 1 placement into 2 placements, they're starting to build a relationship with that project manager, they might sit down and do a team audit to say, look, if you were to stack rank your team in terms of how many of your contractors that you're working with are performing at 80% or higher of your expectation, and in a team that has maybe 10 or 12 contractors, the client might say, well, look, I've got X amount of A players, I've X amount that are meeting expectations, and I've 3 or 4 that are not meeting expectations. because this is contract resourcing and it's not a permanent recruitment solution, the right of substitution exists. So if you know, for example, on this project where you now have 2 contractors in and your project manager or program manager is dissatisfied with 3 of the resources from another provider, and you understand the tech stack and the skills that are in demand, that allows you, when those skills come available, that you can propose them to your client, even where a vacancy doesn't exist, and there's potentially the right of substitution there. So your 2 contractors can easily become 4 and 8 and so on, and your case study goes from being a 300 or 400 case study to €1 million revenue over an 18-month period.
That's all really interesting, Donal, right? But what happens, say, for someone who's maybe starting out or has a small contract book, or who doesn't have the relationships yet, and going back to a comment you made earlier, look, don't take business that doesn't pay, but you might take business that's paying, but maybe on a slightly lower margin because the client has squeezed you a little bit, but you're trying to get that business, and now that client won't pay.
Yeah, that's a really tricky one, and thankfully it's something that can be avoided if you get things right from the outset in terms of being selective about who you do business with. I always think that permanent recruitment is lower risk because most recruitment organizations will do a credit check on an organization before they supply, but permanent recruitment is a professional services fee. You don't want to have a bad debt, but at least you're not out of pocket of having paid, for example, a professional contractor or a temporary agency worker for a number of months. So what I would say is making sure that the proper checks are done before you enter into one of these contracts, and then making sure that you work closely with your accounts department or your payroll department or your accounts receivable department to make sure that payments are adhering to the terms. Because if you're not on top of this and you allow this to run for a period of time, and that's a client that's in financial difficulty or is slow or refusing to pay, it can put a lot of strain on a business. But I think with the right selection of clients from the outset, I think the market in Ireland is much more mature than it used to be. And client organizations realize that the vast majority of the invoice coming through for non-permanent resource is all about the contractor or the temporary agency workers payment, and only a small portion is the agency margin. So I would hope it's not a huge issue for people, but I just say early credit checking, making sure that you're on top of your credit management, and then don't be afraid to move quickly if something is giving you concern.
You mentioned there that the market is becoming more mature, and like that's reflected in the new draft legislation by Heather Humphreys on the updated code of practice on determining who's employed and who's self-employed. And I think it actually ties into one of the questions we had on sign up around, sorry, I'm just going to grab it here now, regulatory requirements for contract staffing. So I think I'll let you touch on the regular. I think you've touched a little bit on the regulatory requirements on temp around, you don't really want them there for more than 23 months because you're getting into that, statutory redundancy period. But this new code of practice, a lot of selling, I imagine, selling contracting to a client who hasn't done it before is the fear of the unknown, or answering the questions that they're not asking you, the questions that they're thinking about or the concerns you're thinking about. And it's always going to be compliance. So you need to understand, I think it's important for consultants to actually understand what the whole process is and how it all works, and about limited companies and umbrella companies, just at a very, very high level, and about about how payroll works, and and about how tax is paid, and that the company has tax clearance. But I also think that and if people do need that type of training, Jennifer and her team do that training for agencies. But I think this new code of practice will be really, really helpful, because it specifically mentions gig workers and platform workers, but also independent contractors. So it's going to give, understand that legislation as well, and it'll help the consultants give your clients a bit of peace of mind around that too.
Brilliant, yeah. And I think some of the other areas that we want to touch on, I'm conscious that we're short time-wise, so I want to just fly through a few of the questions if we can. But one of the questions that's come through a couple of times is on the view of dual desk versus dedicated recruiter, and dedicated perm or contract recruiter. And just a couple of comments on that. I would say for an organization or an individual that wants to really focus in the area, the focus has to be completely on contract resourcing or on temporary resourcing, because as I was saying earlier on, the metrics that you've got to think about is what is your monthly and quarterly GP expectation? What's your average margin per hour per day? And then working backwards to see how many runners you need to have, understanding your attrition rates. So what's your average length of assignment, whether it's really short-term stuff with temps or whether you're lucky enough to have, as Jimmy was saying, with professional contractors, you might have 9 months of an average assignment. That shows you what your net gain required per month needs to be. And that allows you to forecast your revenue stream very closely and then figure out when it's appropriate to split your desk into different verticals and actually grow a larger book. But I would say and it depends on the market you're in. So if we're talking about some of the core areas for contractors or for temps, so IT, engineering, pharmaceutical, I would advise organizations to go with pure dedicated contract recruiters. Again, on the temporary side of things for logistics, drivers, construction, etc., I think you've got to be, when I was a construction recruiter back a long time ago, we were placing 20, 30 people on a Monday, which sounds amazing. But you'd have such a level of attrition because they could have been quite short-term assignments. Our margin was only €2, or I think it was even pounds, maybe £2 per hour. But by the time you got a desk to having 100 or 250, your billings were over €1 million. So it was high volume, high turnover. But our net gain metric, I remember when I started, I inherited a desk that had about 50 construction temps, trade and labor temps on it. And I worked back the numbers and I realized I wanted a net gain of 5 per month to get that desk to 100 temps out, which I did in the first kind of 8-9 months. And then by year 2, I had 250 people or 250 temporary agency workers on that desk, still only €2 per hour margin on a 40-hour work week. But when you have 250 out, you've got over $1 million GP. And at that stage, we started to build out the team and kind of replicate it again and again. And the economies of scale really work well at that stage. So you've really got to understand your numbers. Having said that, if you think about other areas, like, for example, procurement or HR or more professional services areas where you mightn't necessarily see the demand for a fully contract desk, the dual desk option is brilliant there, because if you've got 5 or 10 contractors out, that covers your salary, your cost of your desk, and then your permanent placement is a direct contribution to profit. So the dual desk solution, if you're not in an area that's synonymous with professional contractors or temporary resourcing, is still a really good solution. And I think it's far better than being completely exposed to perm. So that's just.
There's also a question in there from Alan about he's working with construction workers who want to start working on RCT instead of PAYE. Now, what that essentially means is they want to be self-employed. But one of the things we look at, and it won't answer your question fully, Alan, but it ties into your point, Donal, about if you have logistics people or construction people, temporary agency. I think a good bar typically is the average industrial wage, which is a little over €40,000. If you're kind of under that 45, if you're under €50,000 a year, equivalent salary, you're an employee or a temp agency worker. Because you don't have that professional skill where when you look at the code of practice for who's a contractor and who's an employee, you're not going to make the marks in those ones.
Yeah. I think that's spot on. And there's another question that came in here from Fran from Nursebank, and I think this is a very good one. It's about the candidate stream and how do you identify candidates that are open to contract or open to temping and so on like that. This is where the discipline part comes in, because most recruitment companies, they've 3 candidate streams. You've got your database, you've got your ad responses from your online advertising, and then you've got the candidates that are proactively reached out to through either LinkedIn or job board, CV banks, or through kind of mapping the market and figuring out who people you want to talk to are. The question that I think has to be asked to every candidate that's being screened, even though they may be looking for a permanent opportunity, is are they open, like if it's a senior finance professional, are they open to an interim assignment? They mightn't have thought about it, but if you can give the example of an interim assignment that might be 6 months work on a day rate of €800 per day, and some of what Jimmy and Jen have talked about in terms of that ability to provide services through an umbrella company or a limited company and gain some of the control and tax planning benefits, you'll find that a lot of people, when they hear how lucrative the day rate premium is, are open to it. And once you've got those candidates screened and properly classified on your own ATS or your own database to know who are your perm only candidates, who are your contractor or temporary only candidates, and who are the ones that are open to both. At least then you've got something to take to market. And it's about getting that balance right when you look at your day to see how many candidates are being screened and how many of those are being placed, and adjusting your time accordingly between, have you got enough product, if you want to put it that way, to bring to market to sell, and if you have too much product and not enough opportunities, you just need to rebalance your time to promoting candidates that you see as highly placeable in the market.
There's a question there from Gary, and it's about can contractors get mortgages? Short answer there, guys, is yes. And I touched on it before, but a contractor is essentially someone who's self-employed, and self-employed people get mortgages all the time. You just know the right way to go about it. I've just put a link in the chat section there to the Recruiters Hub. We have a Recruiters Hub on our website, which gives you loads of good information. And there's one specifically there on mortgages for contractors. So if anyone is coming across that problem, you get all the information you need in there. And if you don't find the answer, give Jennifer a call. She'll help you out.
Yeah, and that's a really good one, because that's one that's come up again and again on the agency side. And it's actually, I've seen a huge shift in that area, because the perception was, I'd say 5 years ago, I'm not going to take a contract opportunity because I'm thinking about going for a mortgage. And now when contractors are seeing their earning potential and they're thinking about the central bank requirements for, calculating your loan capacity against your gross income, I think now they're saying, actually, I can get a better mortgage if I'm working as a professional contractor and I have higher earnings. Yeah. So
Donal, I'm conscious of time, and there was a big hamper there to give away. So I'm going to throw. Do you have a question, Jen? I have one if you don't.
I do, yeah. I think Donal, I suppose at the start of the briefing this morning, you were looking at, I suppose, if those who are maybe new to the contingent, so consultants who are new to the contingent workforce, I suppose, and are looking to try and build that desk. I think you had given us a nice figure. So this should be at least an answer that should be the same across the board for everybody. So you'd given us, I think, a GP figure at the start of that people should be aiming towards. So I suppose if everybody remembers that figure, wants to throw it in the chat, and if we all can't remember it,
first one in wins a hamper.
Oh, there we go. We will go to you.
David Cogan, first one in. Fair play to you.
Very good. Very good. And
we throw in a couple of runner-up prizes there for
we will indeed.
A couple of people after that as well.
Brilliant. And there's just one other question that I saw that I wanted to talk about really quickly, and that's how you move from. I think it's all about scale. Once you've made the first few placements with a company, how do you get it to scale? And I think it's all about making it easier for the organization. So there are things that you can look at, like, for example, when you've placed your first number of contractors or your first number of temps, sitting down with the organization, doing some rate card management. You may have to sign a non-disclosure agreement, but helping them to look at their contractor population, seeing where they're coming from, what the average margins being paid are. Can you propose a bigger solution? That where, for example, you enter into a master service agreement and you'll give them rate card visibility and demystify some of their spend on contractors. How can you add more value, as Jimmy said earlier on, maybe around compliance, pre-engagement screening, rate card management, access to where talent is available, all of that kind of stuff. And I'm trying to see, I'm just looking to the side here to see if there's anything else that we want to talk about. I think we've covered most of it.
Yeah, unless there's any last minute questions, but I think we've covered.
Must be all talked out on.
Very, very much so. Well, look, can I just say then, on behalf of the NRF, a huge thank you to Jimmy, Jennifer, Michael, all the team at ContractingPLUS. Of course, we value very much the partnership that we've had with you guys for many years. And I think it's really important in keeping everybody up to date, not just on the contractor and compliance side of things, but on best practice across the industry. So thank you both very, very much.
Thanks for those kind words, Donal.
Super stuff. Well, look, we'll wrap it up there for today. For anybody who has colleagues that you think will benefit from hearing some of the bits and pieces, it'll be available on LinkedIn and YouTube to watch back should you wish. Thanks so much, everybody. Brilliant. And we'll see you all again
soon. Good
soon.
morning. Have a great day.
Bye.